welcome you to our CCL training program. It's a weekly webinar of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and tonight we're going to have a webinar that's all about exploring handling difficulties in lobby meetings. This is part of our ongoing Working with Congress training series in advance of our summer conference and lobby days. And tonight we're going to navigate or demonstrate really how to navigate some particular difficult or tricky situations. We're going to have a whole host of friends joining me. Along with myself, we'll hear from Tamara Staten, our Education and Resilience Coordinator, Ellie Sparks, our Senior Director of Programs, and Mindy Aller, our Liaison Coordinator, as well as Regional Director of the North Wind region. A little orientation, just in case you haven't had the chance yet to see the upcoming trainings or a review of kind of the ones that have been in the past. I know looking around the room, a lot of us have already been a part of some of these, but just in case you're also curious about what we've talked about and what especially we're hoping that people are going to attend to, these top two are especially relevant for anyone that's going to be part of our summer conference and lobby day. Ben Pendergrass and Jen Tyler, our two Government Affairs Senior Director and Vice President of Government Affairs, are going to be leading these two. On the 20th of May, we're going to be revealing what our main asks are, both the primary and supporting asks for our June lobby day. And then on the second one, just that later that week on the Thursday, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how that fits into the larger context of where Congress is at right now, and really share probably 2/3 of that time just for open Q&A for anything that you are dealing with as we get into preparing for lobby day. If you haven't yet, we also have this whole other additional series, depending on if you're a new volunteer, depending on if you have any questions. We have a Q&A, just especially for first-time attendees. We always like having that available on the 28th. We just last week did the Transformative Power Citizen Advocacy, where it all started with Marshall and talking about all of our roles in helping shape and influence Congress and being the change that we wish to see in the world. This coming week, we're going to actually do a review on how to have a practice meeting, how you can prepare and plan for your meeting and what that actually looks like in action. We're going to kind of demo a couple of actual mock meetings and show what that looks like so you can put those to use. We're going to do a review of what Congress and how Congress works, or if it's working, for understanding Congress basics. We'll have the chance, especially if you're a lobby lead heading into the summer conference, to review that. And then if you're curious about CCL's expanded policy agenda, we've got a great training with Daniel Luciatelli heading into DC on that too. So a whole suite of options. None of these are expected for you to attend, except for really these top two that I've featured. But especially if you have people on your team that are curious about a particular angle or just want a little refresher, we offer these every year just so that you can feel on the same page and feel refreshed, restored, renewed, ready to go for lobby day. And so with that, though, let me just jump into our agenda. Kind of first half review of just talking first through process for overcoming objections. We're going to have some specific scenarios and how you can handle them with lobby questions that might come up. We'll review some additional resources that are available for you to explore on your own time. And then after that first Q&A, we'll talk a little bit more about some other situations that are rarely something you'll encounter, but just in case they do come up, we'll review them so that you feel prepared, and then talk about a little bit of a review before opening up for more Q&A. And in this training tonight, we're really going to kind of use this review of basically bad, good, better, just to highlight, even though some of it might feel a little bit tongue-in-cheek, you've got a variety of options, right, as a lobby lead, as a lobby participant. And so it's up to you on how to really respond. Sometimes it will map a whole kind of scenario of what might happen if you choose one pathway or the other. Keeping in mind that there's not just one better response, right? It's going to really, we lean in and trust our volunteers. So we know that if we keep our interests best and engaging and even have the input from your end, we'll be able to kind of co-create some of these solutions together. But let's jump right in here. So, really the important thing to take away from this exercise isn't the content, but really the process. When first presented with an objection or concern, our natural inclination, at least mine is to really come back with a fact or tell someone why they're wrong. However, research shows us that there's a better way to really engage, and that's first to connect on shared values. And so in most cases here, what we're going to do to prepare them to accept what we're highlighting through this simple journey of 5 steps. And let's review each of these kind of a little bit more to explore on how you can use these in your meetings to improve the process. Number 1, assume positive intent. That's a great phrase, and more often than not, a person's objectives really are genuine. So it's more likely that we are biased to blame someone as wrong or disingenuous or even less intelligent if they have a belief that's contrary to our own. That's really, core to social science, right? So to counteract this blame bias, we are going to practice arming ourselves with this assumption of positive intent. Doing so can not only change the context of that relationship that we're building with the meeting, but it also can create the conditions within which we can develop an actual productive relationship with our member of Congress or their staff. So once we've gotten that as our mindset, that second step along this journey here is asking questions and continuing to find ways to keep returning the conversation back to a question to who you're meeting with. In order to understand or determine what the underlying value is behind statements that we might hear made in lobby meetings, we practice asking open-ended questions, the who's, what's, where's, when's, why's, how's, to draw out more information and to really find out that once a member of Congress has finished sharing their thoughts, they're going to be much more willing to listen or engage in what we have to say if they feel heard and affirmed for what they've already shared. And then kind of we can put that in the context of what we're trying to share. Number 3, the importance of listening, right? People are much more likely to be open to what you have to say once they feel like they've been listened to, what I just highlighted. You can help them feel heard by asking questions to make sure that you understand their concerns properly. And another great technique here is something just basically reinstating or reaffirming their question in a way with your comments so that you can establish that you've understood what they're sharing. Number 4, finding common ground, establishing common ground by sharing those concerns, connecting them to your values, why you're there, what brought you to DC, how they and you relate on that most core of issues. You can articulate places of agreement with their values or the concerns that they're expressing, and even use those to reframe the conversation. It sounds to me like what you're looking for is a more effective solution or something like that, right? When possible, try to resonate or agree with their values. I agree with you. Effectiveness is a very important value for me as well, however you want to name that. And you can continue this on, but by saying something like, this might not satisfy you, but what I like about the bill is blank. And then being able to kind of engage on the discussion of the merits of the policy you're discussing. And lastly, what we also want to practice, and this again can be a little bit odd at first, but once you get into practice, it's really quite natural, of making sure before you share information to get permission to proceed. So you can basically make sure, I've actually got a study that I can tell you a little bit more about that. Would you be interested in finding out more? Or it sounds to me like what you're really concerned about is this. Would you mind if I shared what I thought when I first encountered that same thought? Something like that, being able to frame that asking for permission is key because then they're bought in and you can move the conversation forward. Do these process suggestions always work? Of course not. So we also want you to acknowledge that you can do your best and not to, lose your cool when it doesn't. One phrase that I always have in my back pocket is to lean back on, tell me more. In the heat of the moment, it's a great way to continue to engage, ask that question, find out more, and listen as you're trying to find your own way to kind of frame your response on that common ground. All right, so with that in place, let's go through a couple of these scenarios. Each of these topics is, something that may come up in your meeting, whether it's the specific theme or a related one that you might encounter with the policy agenda that you're encountering. Some of them are more likely to come up in a conservative or a liberal office. Some you might hear of in both. Hopefully, after we demonstrate a bad, good, and better response to each of these common problems, you'll have an idea of what you might say and do when you run into these situations. So remember this before we kick things off. Stay focused and respond to what they say, not what you think they should hear. And so for this very first section, we're actually going to be taking turns. Mindy's going to be joining us. I'm going to play the member of Congress, and we'll have Mindy play the volunteer. And then she will debrief what we've kind of highlighted as a way to think through that discussion about what about China and India. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Mindy.
Overcoming the China and India objection. A common misperception is that it doesn't matter what the U.S. does on climate because China and India aren't making any changes. As we've highlighted, it can be tempting to ignore the concern that's being expressed and dive right into proving your point and telling the other person that they're wrong. Let's consider the following example of a staffer expressing concern about what other countries are doing and their need to step up in reducing emissions as well.
All right, so I'll play the role of the staffer here in this scenario, and we can just start with the following statement. Well, thanks again for highlighting that, Mindy, but it doesn't matter what we're going to do in the US because China and India are burning so much coal right now.
A tempting but less than optimal response might sound something like this: a bad response. Yeah, well, a lot of Republicans fail to acknowledge the facts about what China is doing to address climate change. Such a response is likely to put the staffer on the defensive, and your work of building a relationship has just gotten much harder. Instead, you might go for a response that acknowledges the staffer's concern and then gently pivots to a few benefits about the bill while still integrating their concern. Such a response might sound like this: a good response. China and India are important, as are other global polluters. The good thing about our policy proposal is that no matter what they do or don't do, we'll have more jobs, increase our competitiveness, and the air and water in our district will be cleaner. Once you've taken the opportunity to validate their concern and perhaps point out a few bill benefits, you might then add an open-ended question, a better response. That's a valid concern. Would you tell me more about why that matters to you? When you respond like this, it opens the possibility of further, deeper conversation that not only educates but builds relationships. Such a conversation might continue something like this.
Sure, we see it this way. If the US is the only country right now eliminating fossil fuel jobs and fossil fuels as a source of energy, then China and India are free riding at our expense, and we can't stop global warming by ourselves, can we?
So, what I'm hearing you say is that if there was a way to bring China and India along, then it would be much easier for this office to support climate action and emissions reductions. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, but there would be a lot of other issues that we'd have to overcome as well.
I can appreciate that, Brett. Getting back to China and India and that concern, I had the same concern, and then I heard about how Reagan used a border adjustment to bring other countries along when combating the hole in the ozone layer. Would you like to hear more about what Reagan did to eliminate free riders? Debriefing the China and India response. Here are some things you might notice in this example. Notice the bad response didn't assume the staffer's positive intent. Notice how the better response started with acknowledgement of the staffer's statement and was followed by a question. The bad and the good response told the staffer what we wanted them to hear. It's only after we asked clarifying questions and listened were we able to respond to the value underlying the staffer's concern. That is, free riding. If in doubt on any issue, tell me more can be relied on to continue to find an underlying issue or value. Also, notice how with the better response, you can pivot back to your purpose and ask for permission to proceed.
Excellent review. Thank you for that, Mindy. And obviously, I think that's a great demonstration and action of a lot of what we've just been talking about, being able to kind of put together. All right, so let's actually then kind of next from Mindy's example, jump right in to another common example that Ellie is going to set us up thinking through.
In your interactions with some congressional offices, it's possible that you'll hear concerns that low-income households will be negatively impacted by any increased costs due to a climate policy that CCL is advocating for. There's a common concern that low-income communities will be left behind, and in some cases, a strong desire to correct for current and past injustice. For this scenario, we'll be using CCL's policy agenda area of carbon pricing and the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act to frame the discussion. But many of the same principles apply to other areas of our policy agenda as well. Here's our interactive question. What do you think a staffer might be concerned about in terms of low-income communities will be left behind? Put your ideas in the chat. In some districts, the main concern is air pollution from a local port or refineries or freeways, but it might be different in your district or state. So the question is, what do you think a staffer might be concerned about when they say they are concerned about low-income communities will be left behind? Great. Thank you for sharing. So you can see there are a lot of different possibilities for what they may be concerned about. Could be jobs, investments, affording cost increases. It can be tempting to ignore these concerns and jump right into sharing financial facts about the solutions we're advocating for, or the need for bold action. Now, that might sound something like this. Well, we need effective action which drastically cuts carbon emissions within 10 years. And with a policy like the Energy Innovation Act, the majority of low-income families and individuals come out ahead and are protected against rising prices. In your conversations that focus around these concerns, you might consider first asking for clarification about their concern. And once you do that, you might discover information that allows you to focus on the health benefits of the policy rather than just the financial benefits for low-income households. Since for some audiences, the concern is more about the health effects of pollution than the financial effects. It can be helpful to understand that, unlike cap and trade programs that include offsets, there's no reason to expect emissions hotspots to increase under a carbon fee. A focus on health might sound something like this. You say, "Thank you. I'm also concerned that some communities might be left behind. Tell me more about your specific concern there."
Well, I'm worried that this kind of solution won't clean up the toxic air pollution that affects low-income communities, frontline communities, people that are living right next to refineries, chemical, plastic manufacturing plants, you name it.
You can continue. That is a very valid concern. Low-income communities are often impacted first and the worst from climate change and environmental pollution. Through the strong incentives in the policy to clean up the energy grid and its pollutants, the Energy Innovation Act is projected to prevent the premature deaths of some 90,000 Americans each year, thanks to cleaner air and a stable climate for everyone to enjoy. Because low-income communities suffer the worst from pollution, many will stand to benefit directly from the health co-benefits of this policy. We'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that. Then once you've validated them and pointed out some health benefits, you might offer to speak about the financial effects, which might sound something like this. You say, "I'm so happy to share more about how the dividend part of the policy can help people financially. Would you be interested in hearing more about the studies that highlight how returning money back to households as a carbon cashback can protect lower income earning families from any rising energy costs?" Please keep in mind that while a policy like the Energy Innovation Act should not exacerbate environmental injustice, it will not eliminate it. As with climate change, there is no one single policy or silver bullet that will end environmental injustice on its own. Notice the good response started with an acknowledgement, sharing the staffer's concerns, and then asking a question. And an even better response offers more content, but asks for permission to proceed before going into it. With people who express concern around working with the other side. For Democrats, it can feel like Republicans have been unwilling to really engage on climate solutions. For Republicans, it can feel like Democrats want to use climate change as a wedge issue to bash Republicans or use it to advance their overall, quote, big government agenda. Here's what you might want to say, but it may be alienating for people on either side. "Well, we're never going to get anything done on climate if we don't start working with the other side." Yikes. In our conversations with either side, we want to be careful not to push too hard. Instead, we want to do our best to meet individuals where they are and understand that not everyone is up for reaching across the aisle. In your conversations with both Republicans and Democrats, that might sound something like this. You say, "Our country is very polarized right now, so it's understandable that trust across party lines is difficult." Once you've made it clear that you're willing to meet them where they are at, and they seem open to your perspective, you might add something that makes your perspective more clear. In conversations, you might sound something like this. We think bipartisan support is necessary for durable and effective climate solutions. A single party solution is likely to be fragile and undone if and when there is a shift in power. We see a need to bring both parties on board to support climate solutions. And we see the best way to do that is by building relationships based on respect.
Well, thank you for that as well, Ellie. And what I'd like to actually do here is we're going to review one last place where you can find a couple more additional resources. But before anything else, just in the chat, what did you hear? What stood out to you with each of the 5 steps that we've included? And with any of these scenarios that we've reviewed so far with Mindy and Ellie, what really do you feel like you noticed as an effective way to engage and in a situation that might have felt challenging at first, really be able to build out a further conversation? Was there something that was demonstrated that assumed positive intent, engaged by asking more questions, reflected back listening as an important value, establishing that common ground, like you put here in the chat, Christian, asking permission to proceed? What was it that for you really kind of stood out as an effective tool that you're going to add to your toolkit now after these first scenarios? All right, so while people are typing that in here, just so we're going to go to open Q&A in just a moment here, but just some key takeaways for this first half. The important thing really from this demonstration, again, is not the content itself, any of these specific scenarios that might come up, but this process that we're kind of modeling over and over. When first presented with an objection or concern, our natural inclination is to fight right back and give a fact haymaker, if you will. However, what we remember with Dr. Hayhoe and others in teaching us is that you only are as effective as how you can connect on shared values before someone is ready to accept what you might have to say or what really brought you to that meeting in the first place. So in order to determine what's the underlying value behind the statement, we ask questions to draw out information. We establish common ground by sharing their concern, really demonstrating that we're both on the same team, looking out at that same vantage point or challenge together and connecting ourselves to that value. And again, just that whole art of asking for permission or engagement to proceed so that they really open up to being ready with what we'd like to share too. If you have any other questions about specifically kind of some of the policy impacts that we have, especially around carbon pricing and a lot of the questions that you might encounter, we have a wonderful page. If you haven't explored it yet, it's just called Handling Challenging Questions about the Energy Innovation Act and other policies that we have. I put it in the chat. And what it does a great job of doing is, it's again, just a whole compendium of different concerns. And it not only talks about responses, but talks about the underlying values that people might have in expressing that concern, provides background with, helpful studies or links to outside sources that you can cite, but then also really helps you figure out how you can offer a response while engaging in that dialogue to ask them questions too. So it's not just a chance for you to open up and spout information for 5 minutes. But I'd like to briefly cover some of the suggested ways you might respond to 5 distinct situations, including overcoming climate skepticism or denial. So Thomas, I'm glad to see that in the chat. What you might do if you encounter a fellow member of your lobby team who just goes off the handle and starts yelling. Someone that's saying something that's factually, incorrect or needs clarification. Going off topic, how to rein back in the conversation if somebody kind of keeps rambling or isn't really following your ultimate plans that you laid out. And then how you can also deal with pushback from people on the same side of an issue, but ultimately kind of might feel dejected or don't agree with your overall tactics. So what I'd like to do first and foremost, though, is actually pass it to Tamara. And Tamara's going to go through kind of some of the considerations in the scenario of what this could look like if we are bumping into climate skepticism.
Okay, so let's talk about overcoming climate skepticism or denial. There's this huge misperception that when we're lobbying, we face climate denialism in congressional offices all the time, but actually nothing could be further from the truth. However, we do understand that the potential for dealing with a denier in Congress creates a lot of anxiety for us. So let's demonstrate a bad and a better way to manage this situation while keeping in mind that this is an extremely rare situation in Congress.
You know, Tamara, the satellite data shows the planet hasn't warmed in over 20 years. So why should we even be doing anything about this?
Well, 99% of peer-reviewed science papers say that it is warming. So you're just ignoring the consensus of science. So here we've taken the bait, we've jumped into an argument and told them they're wrong. Not so effective. So let's talk about a better response.
So, Tamara, the satellite data shows the planet hasn't warmed in over 20 years. So why should we even be doing anything about this?
I do understand that there's a place for uncertainty in the scientific process. We've got satellite measurements, surface measurements, ocean measurements, and sometimes they might provide varying information. If your office would find it useful, we'd love to set up a separate time to discuss the science of climate change and help get a trusted climate scientist from our local community. Is that something your office would be interested in the future? So once you've talked about setting up such a meeting, then you can pivot to discussing solutions. Okay, so let's talk about our responses to climate skeptics. So again, note that the better response started by acknowledging versus telling and was helpful versus confrontational. It leaves the door much wider for breakthroughs than just saying, no, you're wrong. Also, short-term rhetorical victories may feel good to us, at least in the moment, but they're more likely to harden beliefs than to actually change them. We want to help skeptics and deniers find a way forward in their own terms, not forcing our terms on them. So if they ended up supporting our policy based solely on the economic benefits, would you care? And it can also be hard for many of us to validate someone else on this topic because it might seem like our validation is telling them that we agree or that they're right. And validation actually can happen in many different forms, including letting someone know that they've been heard. Moving on to our next challenging situation around human dynamics. When someone says something that's incorrect or needs clarification. So what is your inclination when someone says something that you know is incorrect? Like when I say, for example, fee and dividend is a solution that's clearly going to make poor people worse off and the rich richer. It's just not a solution worth fighting for. So what comes up for you? Like, what are you inclined to do to me? Or what kind of thoughts do you hear in your head? So now if we take it into the offices where we're lobbying and one of our fellow CCL volunteers says incorrectly, oh yeah, well, with a border adjustment, every product that comes across the border will have an adjustment. You might handle it by starting out with a phrase that gently transitions to more accurate information. For example, I'd like to build on that statement just a bit if I could. My understanding is that while in theory, all products could have an adjustment, to keep things simpler, only emissions intensive products like steel, cement, and fertilizer are likely to have a border adjustment, but that will actually be determined by the Department of Treasury. So this can be a difficult skill to learn, as you don't want to seem like you're correcting the first person who shared that. But most of us do struggle to be called out publicly. So we just want to be gentle with that. So we want to handle this situation by giving more detail and building off the first person statement, if you're able to do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for highlighting all of that, Tamara. And what I'd like to do, I guess, to pivot to a few of the other scenarios before we open it up for more Q&A, is just thinking about this next scenario. What happens if you are in a meeting when somebody goes off the handle and basically is just not able to be reined back in with their anger or frustration towards what they feel like in Congress? Now, again, it's important to note that this is a very infrequent situation. I've personally been in over 50 lobby meetings and only seen it one time, and it was very early on in my own experience. So it isn't like you're needing to prepare for this for every meeting. But here are some tips to really handling a situation if you're moving into that. So you might have somebody kind of yelling, "It's you guys in Texas with your oil companies who are stalling and making this worse." Something like that. What do you say in the heat of the moment then? If you're the lead, or if you're on the team, you can really just handle it by saying something like, "Tony, I appreciate your concern and the point you're wanting to make here, but let's get back to what Greg the staffer was just saying about this topic, and then kind of again lean into that conversation where you can pivot gracefully out of a hot kind of powder keg situation. Another thing that you might see when we're thinking about kind of transition elements is going off topic. Now, we've all come across great talkers in our lives. Maybe we have some of those in our own families. But for this reason, it can be helpful to remember that the time monitor is one of our specific roles in the meeting, and they're tasked with keeping an eye out for how much time CCL members are spending relative to how much time the office is talking. And the goal here is 50-50, right? We don't want to be talking any more than what we're getting out of the office, if not less than that even. So they can help with the situation and are really empowered in your meetings. And it's also going to be key for your group to remind each other ahead of time that one more grounding, that one of the goals of the meeting is to get them talking at least half of the overall time. But with all that being said, if someone does go on and on and on in your meeting, a good way to handle this is the following. Outside of, again, making sure that you talk about it ahead of time in prep. You want to wait until there's a breaking point, excuse yourselves for interrupting, acknowledge the position in a very succinct summary, and then pivot back to where they already were with that discussion with the staffer. Where and when might be an easy place to interrupt. Well, you can use your experience. You don't want to obviously have to cut them off mid-sentence unless you're in most dire of situations, but take your opportunity where you can. At an in-person meeting, you can also use body language to interject. You can raise your hand, lean in so it's clear that you're wanting to speak. You can kick them under the table, whatever it takes, right? In a virtual meeting, you can also lean in and unmute to signal that you're ready to speak. You can privately chat them. There's a lot of options either way, depending on your meeting setup. The last thing that I want to highlight for potential difficult situations is this idea that you're going to have the chance to meet with people who agree with you on the importance of climate and prioritizing as a concern, and who understand the urgency of acting, but they might favor another policy. They might have reservations about carbon pricing or permitting reform, or they might have more of a focus on some of the hard-fought, regulations that they've seen fought for being rolled back, or really focus on defending something else rather than the priorities that we come into the office with. And so how should we handle that situation? Well, the big thing really is to highlight, first and foremost, appreciation for their important work. They've done a lot on this issue. Their plans were also important to acknowledge. And the passion that they feel for this chosen approach, as climate advocates, we all can share that as common ground, right? We all share a common goal of transitioning to a decarbonized economy. It's really easy to get upset with people who are already concerned but don't agree with you on our approach. Even with slight differences, we don't want them to get in the way that we're working towards that same overarching focus. So again, refrain from negativity. Don't bash their plan or dismiss their idea. They're proud of it. Tell them that we appreciate it. We know that they're working to get address this done. But we also want to acknowledge that to get it done, what we're trying to do, we need to focus on our areas of advocacy too, right? It's this ecosystem. You could frame it in that very words, right? A concept that our former Vice President of Government Affairs, Danny Richter, loved talking about, is that the environmental movement is like a larger ecosystem. And in any ecosystem, the diversity of life forms is the strength, meaning that the more species there are, the more we are resistant at extinction. So having more than one approach lends a diversity of solutions in the way to give us all strength. And so we're happy to occupy our niche in that overall ecosystem of the climate movement. All right, so let's see if we can remember these 5 steps even without having them queued out here. This is a kind of our final review slide, and then we'll kind of jump into a few little things if you want to make sure to have the chance to get credit for this training, for example. But along the pathway, what are our 5 steps of keeping in mind? Assuming positive intent, asking questions, and engaging in that open-ended art of finding out more. Listening, finding out from that information how you can build out common ground. And certainly, last but not least, proceeding only after you ask permission to continue to engage. And with that, I also want to remind people that you are more than welcome after tonight to ask any other follow-up questions in our forums. I know, looking around the room, many of you are already taking great advantage of that, but they connect us with a variety of staff across CCL, and that's simply just cclusa.org www.cccl.org/forums. So with that, we hope that you found tonight's training useful and empowering. And thank you so much for being here. We look forward to seeing you in person in DC.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.